Thank you, Valentina. I am so excited to be here. We have planned this trip for a couple of months and now it's happening. And it's very exciting to meet with all of you and talk about the science that interests all of us. I'm going to start my clock. So what I'm going to talk about today is what I think is the next frontier in sensory science, which is mouthfeel. So no, this is not the right one. This is for later.
Let's stop the clock.
Stop that.
This is not going to be used against you.
That looks better. All right, thank you. So the next frontier in flavor perception, I believe, is mouthfeel. So why should we care about mouthfeel? If you think of things, I come from industry before coming back to Monell, and I worked at PepsiCo the last part of my career. And the holy grail is really trying to understand how you can imitate the sugary feel of a full calorie beverage and the viscosity. The reason that consumers reject diet beverages is it doesn't give you that fullness and viscosity that you get from sugar-sweetened beverages. So we should care about mouthfeel because of that. We should care because the stickiness of natto is a key driver in the acceptance of that kind of food. The astringency of red wine is a driver of people's preferences. And all variety of snacks are crunchy. And so all of these kinds of mouthfeel attributes really contribute to consumers' acceptance or rejection of products. There's a lot of differences in texture perception and liking between East and West. So if you give something that's slimy to an American, they will reject it. But it's widely popular to have that kind of mouthfeel in a variety of Asian cuisines. So the agenda for today, for my 10 minutes of speaking and 5 minutes of questions, is we know that taste and smell are really integrated in terms of flavor, but we often overlook the role that vision and hearing plays in sensory perception in the mouth. And I'll talk a little bit about all of the different sensory systems and how they interact. I'm also going to do a little bit of anatomy and what we are learning about how we detect mouthfeel. This is the work coming from Moetti at New York University, and she's actually has identified what are the touch receptors in the mouth responsible for mouthfeel. And then I'm going to do a little bit of discussion, not my area of expertise, but I want to talk about oral tribology. Professor Chen knows a lot about this, but I think it's really critical tool in understanding mouthfeel. So the sensory systems of the food and beverage experience, we've already talked about how taste and smell are really well known and how they combine to create flavor. But we also need to consider vision. Did you know that if you take a 10% sucrose solution and you add red food coloring to it, what happens is it's universally perceived as significantly sweeter than the clear one? So those two messages from two separate sensory systems are sent to the brain, integrated in the brain, and lead to very different experiences in the mouth. And I think we often overlook the role that vision plays. We eat with our eyes first. In terms of hearing, the work that came out of Oxford University, Charles Spence, showed that the perception of whether a potato chip is stale or fresh had to do with hearing. And he put earphones on people's heads and they tasted the chips, and he manipulated the frequency So high pitched frequencies, the chips were perceived to be fresher, and louder frequencies or in hertz. When it's louder, it's also perceived to be fresher. And it has nothing to do with what is actually happening in the mouth. So our hearing also affects what the overall perception is, and I think we overlook that. So now we have to turn our attention to mouthfeel. So don't forget about vision and hearing, but when we talk about mouthfeel, look at the myriad of sensations that encompass mouthfeel. We have cold temperature, we have warm temperature, we have kinesthesis, you can have the burn of wasabi, you can have the burn of chili peppers, the cooling of menthol, you can have pain if you bite your tongue in your mouth. It's a part of the sensory systems. You have crunchy, you have sticky, you have greasy, you have creamy, you have chewy. All of these things are the sensory attributes that go into mouthfeel. You have to stop me. Start with the clock. You have to keep me on time. Okay, so mouthfeel, or more holistically, somatosensation, encompasses the different sensory systems that are involved with temperature, with kinesthesis, with pain, and then there's also touch, pressure, force, stretch, and particle detection. So this is just a schematic of what mouthfeel sensory systems are. So somatosensation encompasses, temperature, pain, touch, vibration, pressure, particle size, lubrication, friction, also known as mechanoreception, your jaw position, how much force it takes to bite, the movement. So these are the different sensory systems. If you combine temperature, thermoreception, and nociception, and that the stimulus is coming from the chemical stimuli, that's referred to as kinesthesis. I just had a discussion with a colleague at Monell, and we started talking about whether there is a chemically induced mouthfeel. And we were speculating, and you're going to know more about kukumi than I do, but we're wondering whether kukumi is somehow a chemically induced sensation, and that is mouthfeel. No data on that, just wild speculation, but I would love to have conversations with you about that. In terms of our oral anatomy and what we're learning about the sensory receptors for mouthfeel, what Yalda Moetti has done is she took biopsies from two places on the tongue, but also on the roof of the mouth. The area right behind your cheek has little ridges, and it's called the rugae, and it's critically important in mouthfeel, as I'll show in the next slides. But she has identified what the different receptors are that are responsible for mouthfeel. So at the front of the tongue, we have the fungiform papillae and the filiform papillae. How do I do the? Yeah, that's it. Okay. So the front of the tongue, so both fungiform and filiform. Fungiform, we know, is well known for taste, because that's where the taste buds are. It seems like the filiform papillae are more important in the perception of mouthfeel. In the middle of the tongue, we have primarily the filiform. On the rugae surface at the top, there are a number of newer receptors that have been identified, and she has starting to do work on specifically what they do, but has just identified these different receptors. So in looking at the receptors in the oral cavity, what she has found is that the roof of your mouth, where the rugae is, you may be sensitive or you may not. And the tongue, you may be sensitive and you may not. So there's all different kinds of combinations that are taking place in the perception of mouthfeel, and huge individual differences in activities to mouthfeel. But in the fungiform papillae, which is where the taste buds are, that has been identified. But in the filiform, she's identified a number of different receptors that are very similar to what are in our fingerprints. And the rugae surface is actually unique to each individual, just like our fingerprints are unique. This is work out of Chris Simon's lab, and the student, Brittany Miles, she made a palate blocker that blocked the hard palate, and people put that so that the Lugay receptors were not involved in the experiment. And when the palate was blocked, they were looking at sensitivity to viscosity. And you can see that when you block the palate, this is palate blocked, you can see that the sensitivity to viscosity increases dramatically. The y-axis here is the measure of viscosity. When it's unblocked, the participants were much more able to differentiate the stimuli based on their viscosity. So to understand this, they took a biopsy of the tongue, and they looked at the filiform density, the length, and found out that that's highly correlated to individual differences in viscosity sensitivity. So if you look here, these are the individual filiforms, so they counted density. They also measured the length of the filiform and the width of the filiform. So from, this is the diameter tip, the base, they measured the length. And what they found was, here's the just noticeable differences between the viscosity measurements, and density was related to that. And the length, so the population density, how many filiform papillae you have here, and then also the length of it. If you think of a filiform papillae as a palm tree and it's blowing in the wind, the long palm trees are going to bend more. And so that seems to be part of what are the underlying mechanisms for our detection of mouthfeel. Now, I want to just say a few words about tribology. It's a study of friction, wear, and lubrication between surfaces in motion. It's a perfect model for understanding what's happening in the mouth with food oral processing. So oral tribology, it's important to understand it's a system of interactions. Professor Chen had already done a very similar characterization of this. So you have the person with all of their individual differences in terms of their papilla density, their salivary flow rate. You can measure those things. You can also measure the physical stimulus and what are the characteristics of the product. But when you put the physical stimulus in the mouth of the person, now you have what we like to refer to as the physics in the mouth, because you've got these individual differences, and now we're looking at the oral processing. So it's not a physical property that you can measure, it's a system of interactions. Our traditional product development approach in the past has failed until the inclusion of oral tribology into our product development approach. What we would do is we would measure samples in a very static way and do things like measure viscosity. And then product developers would try to mimic the viscosity of the gold standard. And in a sensory test, what would turn out was they've got different samples here, and they're trying to match it to the gold standard, which is the blue. And then when they do the sensory test, you see that the gold standard is still very far away from the samples because they were not looking at it as a dynamic process. So our goal is to imitate the oral cavity and use physical measurements of oral tribology. 1 minute. Okay. And see whether we can manipulate the products in a dynamic way. So here's an example of measuring in the standard way, looking at the viscosity of yogurts that are 0.1%, 2.0%, or 4.7%. And you can see there's not much differentiation here. Clearly, consumers can tell the difference in the mouthfeel of those. If you use oral tribology measures and look at friction coefficient, instead, what you get is separation. The 0.1% fat yogurt is very high in friction coefficient, and it's not lubricating, and consumers are rejecting that more. They prefer the lower friction coefficients where the mouth feels moisturized and there's a lot of movement there. So oral tribology is adding a lot of value to our product development. I'll just highlight this because I think it's interesting in terms of our movement towards plant-based proteins. And so pay attention most to this graph, which is whey protein, which is here in the blue squares. You can see it's a low friction coefficient, which is what consumers like. It correlates with sensory, and a number of different pea protein, potato protein, lupine, and insect proteins. You can see that the mouthfeel in terms of the friction coefficient is going to be dramatically different. So we're not close at all yet to imitating the whey protein. That's a very complicated slide, so I won't go through that one. I can talk about that later. The take-home message is mouthfeel is a key driver of consumer acceptance and rejection of products. It's complex, it's dynamic, it's one of the gestalt of many sensory systems. Don't forget vision and hearing, interacting to generate the food and beverage experience. Significant progress has been made in identifying the oral anatomy and the receptors for mouthfeel. And to truly understand the food and beverage experience, we need to include oral tribology. It's a great tool. It's key in developing healthier foods with less sugar and fat, foods for vulnerable populations like the elderly that have a real need for lubrication, and more sustainable foods, understanding the astringency and texture of plant proteins. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Linda. Questions from the audience? Please, Professor Chan. We very much welcome your first question on the topic.
I'm very nervous.
About the oral viscosity sensation, you make a similarity Silicon company with palm cheeks. But if you're looking for a Silicon company, there's a very small tip protruding on the top of this company. But I don't think there any literature research about the function of this spoke. I don't know what's the biological
I don't know what the function of that tip is either. Just the identification of some of the receptors for mouthfeel is new. And so I just think that the metaphor of the palm tree is kind of the best that we can think about with flowing a liquid or chewed food over a surface. That it's something to do with the length of the filiform papillae and the density, but I don't know what the individual tip role plays, but it probably plays some role.
Thanks for sharing this with fascinating. I just wanted to ask if there's any work done to consider, even though you have the anatomical findings, but with the same anatomical finding in human subject, the physiological as well as sensory perception is molded away from the neural anatomy.
I'm sorry?
It's different from the neural anatomy. That means even though you have the before form, but with that, subject can be conditioned over time to taste differently.
Absolutely. A lot of learning.
And for example, like the twins who are totally similar, but they brought different, they can taste something that is formed differently because they are conditioned differently.
Yes, experience plays a big role in this. A few years ago, Monell had a fat consortium, and people were unable to distinguish, many people were unable to distinguish skim milk from 18% cream. And everybody is surprised by that result, but we took vision away, which is a big part of recognizing that. And we took aroma away and they couldn't tell the difference. But with training, they were able to get closer and closer. Yes, there's a lot of environmental influences on what happens.
So in the follow-up question, has there been any work done to find out the period of time it takes for conditioning to set in place and whether it's in the sustained condition? Because just to share, in Singapore, we have a large population conditioning to reduce consumption of sugar in our beverages, and such that actually for our beverages like coffee is default no sugar now by the population. That took us a couple of years, at the large population level. From your work and the large studies done, has there been any empirical studies to say how long does it take for conditioning to take place at the glutens?
So I think it depends on what you're talking about. So for salt case, it happens very quickly. When you decrease the salt in your diet, then you make that shift within 6 weeks. We have done work with trying to lower sugar in the diet, and after 3 months, people's preferences didn't change. But with salt, it was only 6 weeks. With the fat consortium looking at people's learning and shifts, it happened with maybe about 6 training sessions. The other question would be, how long does it last? Do you revert back? And is there, after the stimulus hasn't been conditioned, does it revert back?
So something that has hit the world quite remarkably in the last few years is the GLP-1s, GLP-1s.
Right.
Ozempic and all that.
Yes.
And your exposure to the food industry, seeing any changes, especially consumption of food impacted by the advent of such drugs in the market?
So I don't know how much time we have for questions.
This is the last question.
Okay, all right.
I'm being very generous with my 10 minutes last question.
So Amber Al-Hadef at Monel has done the work to discover that the brain neurons that are responsible for the weight loss for the GLP-1 medications is a separate population to the brain neurons that are responsible for the nausea. So those two things are separate neural populations, which opens the gateway for figuring out how to create a drug that doesn't cause the side effects of nausea. We have gotten a lot of calls from our industry partners on what should we be doing in terms of our food creation, product development, because the world is being taken by storm with people going on these GLP-1 medicines. Anecdotally, we know that people report that they prefer less sugar, but there has not been too many systematic studies. We have great interest in pursuing that line of work and are looking for industry partners to work with us to do that. But I got many calls from industry partners saying, what do you know about this? And I'm trying to think, somebody just had a webinar, and I think it was Archer Daniels Midland saying that they are now marketing their products directly for people who are taking GLP-1 meds.